but you need to remember, we're going to put the story into history. And of course, when you start just putting stories into history, well, that ceases to be history. Well, I said to him, do you remember the football game? Football? Oh, the football. Oh, yeah, there was hundreds of us playing. And it's nonsense. It's utter nonsense. There is no way that hundreds of men took part in a game of football.
What is up, everyone? Welcome back to Total Sport, and today we have a very different and a very, very special guest today for your festivities. We're joined by a military historian and advisor, Taff Gillingham. How are you, mate? You good?
I'm very well, thank you.
Yeah, I pronounced your name right this time. So basically, before we get into this, can you just give us a brief description of what you do as your career?
Yeah, sure. Well, as you say, I'm a military historian, but for many years I've been giving historical military advice for film, television and theatre work, and I co-own a company called Khaki Devil up in Bury St Edmunds in Suffolk, and we provide uniforms, equipment, weapons, props, historical advice, locations and all sorts. And as part of that, we have a First World War trench site that my business partner Kev Smith and I built, where productions as diverse as Downton Abbey, Blue Peter, and even people like the Great British Bake Off have been known to come and do pieces for, where they need a trench scene for something to do with trench warfare or something, a documentary about the First War or something like that. And yeah, so that's what we do, and we're actually in the process as well of building a proper First World War visitors centre here at Horsted called Great War Huts. So yeah, we're pretty well immersed in the subject.
That's amazing. And I just think, because I look back, we were watching Downton Abbey recently, actually, I can imagine that where it is now. What was the first thing that fascinated you about military history? Was it stuff in the family, or was it just a natural interest as a child?
Yeah, well, I mean, being born in the 60s, growing up, I mean, it was just all around you still. There were veterans of both world wars. The people who came and emptied your dustbins were Second War veterans. There might still have been First War veterans still teaching you at school. We played with action men, model soldiers. We made model aeroplanes. So it was just something that you just did. One of my grandfathers had fought in the First World War, although sadly he'd gone before I was born. But yeah, there'd always been that sort of family history and just a general interest. And from a very young age, I started collecting uniforms and equipment. And it really just never stopped.
Yeah, definitely. So one thing that we wanted to talk about, as this is a very sport focused, it's called Total Sport, so we have to talk about sport, is the 1914 Christmas Day Truce. Now, there's a lot of rumours go around about this certain day. And I'd like to, this is part of the reason why we wanted to talk to you, is because maybe not all of those would be true or false. Maybe some of them are, who knows? But just give us really a brief explanation of what people think happened. Okay,
well, I mean, just to give you the background, my interest in the truce went back to 1999, where Kev and I and a group of others went and commemorated the truce in one of the places it happened, at a little village called St Yvonne, just north of a village called Plugsteert, which was nicknamed Plug Street by the soldiers at the time. And I really took an interest in it. So since 1999, I just mopped up as much information as I could, newspaper reports of the time, first-hand accounts, books, all sorts. And it became obvious very quickly that there was a lot of misinformation, even at the time, to sort through and sift out. So the truce itself, I mean, there are still people that think it didn't happen. And certainly plenty of First World War veterans that I met were convinced it was made up. They said, no, it's just a myth, like the Angel of Mons in 1914. It didn't happen at all. But it certainly did. As I say, there are no shortage of newspaper accounts about it, and it even appeared in newspapers. The front cover of the Daily Mirror on Friday the 8th of January 1915 had a cover photograph of British and German soldiers all in a row, all clearly mingling. So there is no doubt that it happened. It was spontaneous in all sorts of places along the line. It happened with the Belgians and the French as well, although to a lot lesser extent with the Belgians and the French, because obviously their countries had been invaded, so they weren't quite so of a mood to mix with the Germans. But it didn't happen everywhere. There was plenty of places where British soldiers had obeyed the instructions to keep away from the Germans. In plenty of places, the fighting carried on. The guards had been involved in quite a nasty tussle with the Germans a few days earlier, had quite a lot of men killed, and they weren't in any mood to fraternise. There were plenty of places where British soldiers went to meet the Germans and were just shot and killed, or where they had gone and met the Germans and were then taken prisoner by the Germans. So I think that that one of those myths that it was universal is clearly not true. Often crop up, people say, oh, it's a great example of man's humanity to man. Well, it wasn't at all, really. In December 1914, on both sides, they were still mostly pre-war, regular, professional, hard-bitten soldiers who joined the army for a career. And quite frankly, if the British government had said to the British Expeditionary Force in 1914, right, fellas, you're off to shoot the French or shoot the Belgians, they'd have shot Frenchmen or Belgians with just as much enthusiasm as they were shooting Germans. And to those men, it was nothing personal. It was purely business. It's what they did, which was obviously what the driving force behind the truce was, the fact that here was an opportunity for a day off. And the other big myth about it is that, oh, well, if both sides had refused to carry on fighting, the war had been over. But the thing to remember there is that the Germans, when the war broke out, had an enemy on either side, in that they'd got the French on one side there, the Russians on the other. And the German Schlieffen plan was to crash their way through Europe and knock the French out of the war. And once they dealt with that, then turn their attention and deal with the Russians. So if in December 1914, then the British and the French had decided that they weren't going to carry on the war, the soldiers decided they weren't going to carry on fighting, well, actually the Germans would have achieved what they set out to do in the first place and could then have gone and turned all their attention against the Russians, having already captured most of Belgium and nearly all the useful industrial parts of France. So it would have just been a win for the Germans. That was never going to happen, because in December for 1914, both sides still firmly believed that they were still going to win, and why wouldn't they? And also on the home front, only a few weeks earlier, the German Imperial Navy had shelled places like Hartlepool and Lowestoft and Scarborough and killed lots of civilians with huge German naval shells. The idea that the British public was going, oh, that's all right, then, yeah, you've had a bit of a meet up and it's all peace, love and harmony. Yeah, it's all right, you come home and we'll just forgive them. That was never going to happen. There was not a hope that taking a few hours out over Christmas 1914 was going to bring the war to a stop. And nobody that took part in it really thought it would.
No, I highly doubt that. So one story that does go around is the game of football that happened on 1914. Now, would you say that there's a possibility that it did happen or that it didn't happen? And what can you account from the information that you've gathered since 1999?
Okay, well, the thing with football, the problem I have with football is that during the centenary in 2014, football completely and utterly obliterated the Christmas truce. So all of the actual stories that happened in all of those many places along the line of German barbers who'd worked in London, finding the men whose hair they'd cut before the war and cutting their hair, of swapping buttons and swapping food, exchanging helmets, of Germans giving British soldiers letters and saying, will you give this to my girlfriend in Suffolk and ask if my motorbike's still all right? All of these things happened. There were tons and tons of fascinating stories of games they were playing, of singing together, of burying the dead. Both sides buried the dead. There'd been a lot of men killed during some disastrous attacks on the 18th and 19th of December. And so there are cases where both sides came together, dug a big hole, all of dead buried together. And in one particular place, a German divinity student who was a soldier, he conducted a service, a burial service. All of that was completely submerged by football. And the reality is that football does crop up in the truce. I mean, and one of the reasons that people think it's so prevalent, stories and accounts of the truce are dotted with references to football and analogies. So, we were all out in no man's land milling around like a football crowd. Or we wanted to play a game of football with the Germans, but we didn't have a ball. We wanted to play the Germans, but the colonel wouldn't let us. Or we arranged to play a match with the Germans tomorrow, but they were relieved. So lots and lots and lots of mentions. There's lots of anecdotal evidence. Oh, I heard that there was a game. Oh, I met a bloke who said he took part in a game. There were also lots of blokes that just made it all up. There was a soldier of the 9th Londons who he was convalescing. He was in a hospital in Lancashire or Cheshire actually, and his account of taking part in the truce and playing football appears in a Lancashire or Cheshire newspaper the day after an account by a fellow called Frank Naden, who we know actually published a real, true account. So, but when you look at it, you discover that the 9th Londons didn't take any part in the truce at all. So what's happened is that a newspaper has published the story up in Cheshire and in the hospital, and there's lots of gossip about it. And this fella in his hospital bed's going, oh, yeah. Oh, I took part in that. At which point one of the nurses gets a journalist in, and then suddenly this fellow then tells his story to a journalist, and it's completely made up. And there's lots of that. It's taken many years to gradually sift through all of these and find an account. Oh, this is fantastic. Ah, hang about. That doesn't ring true. They can't have been there. This couldn't happen. And this is just guesswork. So gradually you can knock a lot of this stuff off. What we do know is that down at the little village of Frelinghien, which is just across the border into France, the German soldiers of Infantry Regiment 133, they did take part in a game with 2nd Battalion Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders. There's only one reference I've ever found to it from the Scots side, where a Corporal Patrick Day refers to hearing from another soldier that some of his mates had played a 4-a-side game with the Germans. And on the German side, a German officer called Johannes Niemann, he describes a proper game which took place with his men on a frozen meadow, which again makes sense because a lot of no man's land was just a farmer's fields with plough ruts and crops still in them, absolutely frozen solid. So a flat meadow would make sense. And the Germans talk about the English wearing kilts because the Germans never distinguished between Scots, English, Irish, whatever. So they were all English. And they describe discovering what Scotsmen wore, well, the English wore under their kilts as they were running around playing the game. So this amused them. And that even appears in the German regimental history of Infantry Regiment 133. And another German soldier in 2014, a postcard cropped up of a German soldier who'd written home to his mother, said, we played ball with the English. So 2 corroborated accounts from the same unit in the same place, 1 anecdotal account from the Scottish regiment on the other side talking about a 4-a-side game. So I don't think there's any doubt that probably the only actual proper game took place at Frelinghien, probably 4-a-side, and the German account says that they won 3-2. And there are plenty of other anecdotal accounts which refer to the score of 3-2. So I think that's pretty likely. Up at Wolvergem, which is up in Flanders, north of Plug Street, the 1st Norfolks were facing the German Reserve Infantry Regiment 16, which was the regiment that Adolf Hitler served with. And there were a couple of accounts there from men of the Cheshire Regiment. Now, the Cheshires, the 6th Cheshires, they were a territorial unit who'd only recently arrived in France, and they'd been broken up into separate companies just to learn the ropes. So C Company had been sent up to learn about trench routine with the 1st Norfolks. So they were at Wolvergem on Christmas Day. And Frank Naden, who was a sergeant, he left a pretty good account in the newspaper of everything that was happening that day. And he mentions football in his account. There's also an account by an officer called Brockbank. Lieutenant Brockbank says that there was a bit of a kick about using a little rubber ball. So again, two pieces of evidence there. There's nothing at all from the Germans, from Infantry Regiment 16, and for many years there was nothing at all from the Norfolks, which was really the clincher to me because there were more Norfolks there than anybody else. So where were the Norfolk accounts? And in 2016, we were working on the Sainsbury's Christmas Truce advert, and to begin with, we weren't overly keen to work on it because it was all about football, and we said, well, we don't, we're not going to be encouraging myth making. If you can tone the football down a bit and include some of the other activities, which then we're interested. And then, almost at the last moment, a friend of mine, Dick Rayner, up in Norwich or Norfolk somewhere, he sent me some accounts of 1st Norfolk soldiers that had taken part in the Christmas truce, and one of those photocopied accounts, he put a note on the top, says, I think you'll like this. And it was a fellow called Albert Wyatt, and Corporal Wyatt had taken part in the truce, written home, and his letter had been published in a Thetford newspaper. And he actually mentioned that they played they had a kickabout with the Germans. So suddenly we'd got an account from the Norfolks, 2 accounts from the Cheshires, nothing from the Germans, but clearly there was enough evidence to prove that there was a kickabout, and it almost certainly was only a kickabout because there it was rough ploughed fields, it was crops, it was frozen solid. But that almost certainly, is evidence that there was a kickabout that happened between the British and the Germans there. When we made the Sainsbury's Christmas Truce advert, Kev and I, we actually made sure that everything that went into that advert happened at Wolverhampton on Christmas Day. So all the men that you see in the advert were either Norfolks with a few Cheshires amongst them. We made sure that all the other activities happened were all exactly what happened there. There was no burying the dead because we know that the Norfolks didn't do that. They hadn't been involved in those disastrous attacks. So actually everything that we showed was dead right, with the exception of the fact that they wanted the British soldiers to get out of the trench first, just for creative reasons. And in pretty much every instance, it was instigated by the Germans. Wherever it happened spontaneously, it was always the Germans that got out first. But hey, when it came to the commemoration in 2014, UEFA, because obviously I'd spent a long time studying the truce, UEFA rang me up and said, will you come to Noyon, to our headquarters in Switzerland, and talk to us about the truce, because we want to memorialise it. And so they flew me to Noyon, and I spent a couple of days with them, and we went through everything I've just told you, basically. And they said, well, we'd really like to put up a memorial at Plug Street. I said, well, we know that it didn't happen there. In fact, what we do have at Plug Street is a very, very clear account from both sides, because on the German side there, Infantry Regiment 134, there's an officer called Kurt Zermisch, who'd left a very clear diary. And in fact, I met his son at Plug Street several years ago, before he died, and he translated his father's diary. And in his diary says, the British are happy they have a ball, which is, he thought, and I completely agree with him, that was Zermisch and his men watching the men of the Royal Warwicks having that football match among themselves. It doesn't say my men played with the Germans. But what's happened since then is that what the internet does is people take those accounts and they miss the odd word out, or they misinterpret them, very often deliberately. And in fact, the local tourist board, the Belgian tourist board, were hugely keen to have a memorial at Plug Street. And bear in mind, in Belgium, there's two tourist boards. There's a Belgian-speaking one and a French-speaking one. And the Belgians were very keen that they had this memorial in a place where it didn't happen. In fact, a lady from the Belgian tourist board said to me, oh, yeah, Taff, but you need to remember, we're going to put the story into history. And of course, when you start just putting stories into history, well, that ceases to be history. Then there were other memorials that started cropping up. There was one at the National Memorial Arboretum at Urlwas, which was a cracking memorial of a close-up of two soldiers shaking hands, an Englishman and a German, just the close-up of the cuffs and the hands, which was a hugely appropriate Christmas truce memorial. It summed up the truce, but surrounded in a wire frame of a football. And suddenly it's all about the football, and Prince William comes and unveils it. And then there's a memorial that then crops up at, I think it was Liverpool Cathedral originally, of an English soldier, complete English soldier, a complete German soldier shaking hands, leaning forward. And again, there's a football between their feet. Again, it's like, it's everything just suddenly became about football. Amongst all of that, the true story of the Christmas truce was just completely and utterly submerged. Football played an enormous part in the First World War. The fact that British soldiers were going to France and Belgium, when they were out of the lines, when they were behind the lines resting, they were all playing football amongst themselves. There was organised games, there was inter-division, there was inter-companies, there was inter-battalions, you name it. And the local French and Belgian kids got a taste for it. And in a way, it really pushed and promoted football and encouraged it across Europe in the years after the war. But where it was absolutely insignificant was during that period of the 1914 truce. In fact, I should think, as a rough guess, there were probably something like 30,000 British soldiers alone that took part in the truce, or were in the front line at that time. And if 30 of them actually took part in a kickabout with the German army, I'd be surprised. And certainly when we made the Christmas truce advert, it really brought us home to us, because watching it being made, we got, I don't know, I think it's about 180 fellas there dressed as British and German soldiers, cutting hair, playing cards, having a sing, and doing all those things. And there were 20 fellas playing a game of football. And what I can say is that in a huge field with a couple of hundred men in it, 20 men playing football would have been seen by everybody, because it was just so obvious. And if football had been that prevalent, it would have been in everybody's accounts, everybody writing about it. And it just isn't. And then you get people like Ernie Williams, who did serve with the 6 Cheshires. When he was interviewed in the 80s, I think he was on World of Sport or Grandstand, one of those sort of Saturday afternoon programs, he mentioned. Well, they said to him, you know, do you remember the football game? Football? Oh, the football. Oh, yeah, there was hundreds of us playing. And it's nonsense. It's utter nonsense. There is no way that hundreds of men took part in a game of football. You know, it would have been mentioned. It would have been such a spectacle. And Ernie, like so many others, just made it all up.
That's amazing, honestly. Just listening to that, like, honestly though, it's just like how things can get so convoluted and stuff like that. It's unbelievable. But yeah,
I mean, it was an interesting example. Just, you know, if you take it aside, if you take the war out of it, if you take the football out of it, just as an example of how you can take one single historical event and literally in front of your eyes, you can watch it being twisted and distorted out of shape and turned into something completely different. And that literally is what we all saw happen in 2014.
It's unreal, but yeah, it's just been amazing. Thank you so much for speaking to me.
That's a pleasure.
So just before we go, where can we find you on social media? Where can we find all your work and stuff for anyone watching?
Okay, so Khaki Devil, you'll find Khaki Devil on Twitter, on Instagram and on Facebook, and you'll find Great War Huts, our First War Museum project on there as well. So Khaki Devil, Great War Huts, and me, Taff Gillingham, you'll find me too. So do feel free to follow us, and we've got our own YouTube channel as well, Great War Huts, where we tell some great little stories and some little sort of 2 or 3 minute little pieces about interesting artifacts that we've got in our collection, and some sort of half-hour or hour-long talks about interesting military subjects.
That's amazing. Well, I'll leave a link to all of that in the description. And yeah, thank you so much, Taff, once again. And yeah, for you lot at home, I hope you have a very, very Merry Christmas. And don't be getting convoluted about the Christmas truce because it's historically inaccurate. But yeah, thank you very much for watching, everyone. And we will see you next time.